One, it is superly an honor to be here. Travis, it's always amazing, and so thank you so much. Let's begin. Jesse, which I'm super honored that Jesse is here, that he got to join us today, and myself. I just added this slide like 2 minutes ago, so you can see the formatting is a little wacky. I just want to start off with an overview of colonization. Over 530 years, this October will mark that distinction. This is a Swampy Cree Two-Spirit artist named Kent Monkman, and this was for a piece of work that was commissioned by the Met in the Metropolitan Museum, and it was hanging in their grand concourse. So it's beautiful. That basically is telling the story of colonization, so I just want to share that with you. Overview. In 3 minutes. Oh, schools, residential boarding schools opened. This is the first of its kind. This opened in Carlisle, Pennsylvania in 1879 and continued to around 1918. About 100,000 Native children went through its doors while it was open from approximately 140 nations. That's one school. Just a little fun fact. How many kids graduated, fully matriculated to a grade 12 out of this school? 158. Not per year, total, out of 100,000 Native children. And what ended up happening is these became the children of lost generations. They didn't know their language or their culture, so they were too white to be Indians, and they were too brown to be whites, and so they were displaced. And so I just share with you that this is one of the major tools of colonization.
And a piece just to revisit or talk about Canada's example, visiting our past. So in 1928, sterilization begins. So Alberta passes the Sexual Sterilization Act and begins sterilization of residential school students to prevent them from giving birth and continuing our culture. So the legislation was appealed in 1972, not that long ago, literally not that long ago. So 1933, BC begins sterilization. So these are two huge examples that are still somewhat enacted actually in Canada, but also were repealed in not too long ago.
Research and colonization. Experiments, and this is again one example, right? Experiments were performed by the Department of Indian Affairs of Canada, unethical nutritional experiments performed on Canadian Aboriginal children in 6 residential boarding schools for a decade. Dr. Percy Moore, Dr. Frederick Tisdale, and I think it's important that we name those names. Their experiments, parents were not informed and nor were consents ever obtained. And even as Indigenous children were dying as a result of malnutrition, the experiments continued. Even after the recommendations of the Nuremberg trial of human trial experiments, that this was still being carried on in 1942 to 1952. Now I share these with you, and thank you very much, Jesse. Why did we start off with the residential boarding schools? Why did we talk about the sterilization in the 2 provinces that had the Sexual Sterilization Act? And now for research. In that research, as well as education, as well as medical professions, in that when you are doing these works, you believe that you are a part of noble professions because you are doing good work and good public work, education, healthcare, research. But as we showed in these 3 little examples, peaks, that these 3 noble professions are handmaidens of colonization. And so we must own that history. Because as a Native person, we all know this history. Many non-Native people do not know this history or don't put a face to it. We are putting faces to this history.
So Two-Spirit peoples. So this is a beautiful image by artist Corey Bulkett. So the concept of Two-Spirit. So this is a conversation that Harlan and I and a lot of folks are having more and more. Two-Spirit is an organizing strategy / tool and not an identity. So this is a huge conversation that we're having. It's an all-encompassing concept. It's not limited to one or the other. So that's a huge piece, especially in regards to research, which Harlan will be talking to later on in his presentation. So Two-Spirit does not make sense unless it is contextualized within Indigenous frameworks of communities, and within a traditional setting was a gender analysis and not necessarily a sexual orientation. So today we're typically seeing Two-Spirit associated with the LGBTQ community. However, the work of Two-Spirit organizations, leaders, elders, and community members is more akin with traditional understandings of, say, a gender analysis, and it's inclusive of, not limited to, just sexual orientation. So quick history of the term. So up until contact, we had our own words. So we'll get into that in a minute, but there was a number of words before Two-Spirit and Berdache came. So 1942, CC came, did his thing, thought he saved all of us. And a good point Harlan always brings up is also 1942, the Indigenous folks woke up and saw CC. They found him, not him finding us. So that's a huge piece and a different perspective that we always like to challenge the narrative that is taught.
Although 1942, yes, it happened. 1492.
1492, sorry. So 1492 to a little bit later than 1492, but to 1989 or 1990, the term Berdache was used. And Berdache is a term, I don't know if many have come across it, but maybe if you've looked into research in the 80s, it is a term that is constantly used, and it's a pretty harmful word. The definition comes, there's a number of definitions within Italian, Spanish, and French, but it's quite a derogatory term, especially towards folks within the queer community, the Two-Spirit community. So then present, a number of Two-Spirit folks came together in the early 90s at a national gathering in Winnipeg and decided to utilize or to establish the term Two-Spirit concretely, to give us a voice and a tool to move forward as Two-Spirit people.
So how do we understand a world that has more than two genders? We're talking really fast because we want to get through this content. So how do we understand a world that has more than two genders? So for us as the Cree community, this list is by no means complete. It's a survey. I just looked across Turtle Island and I just picked and chose a couple of examples. So if we were a part of the Cree community, we had the men's camp and a woman's camp, and a woman couldn't go to a man's camp and a man couldn't do a woman's camp. But us as a Yaqui, us as Two-Spirit communities, we could go to both camps. And so if there was ever imbalance or disharmony amongst these two different camps, we as Two-Spirit people could roll over to the women's camp and we could find out what's going on. We could go over to the men's camp and we could harmonize and bring peace back to these two camps. A man couldn't do this, a woman couldn't do this, just us as Two-Spirit people could do this. And so the takeaway from this slide is Two-Spirit is going to mean something different because it's a societal definition or expectation of your role within society. And so each nation would have different roles or different societal expectations for their Two-Spirit relatives, for these genders. And so again, Two-Spirit is going to mean something different from nation to nation, or those nations that had a Two-Spirit tradition.
So this is quite a large list that Harlan's been able to put together over the last couple of years. We've been able to find about 130 terms throughout Turtle Island to identify or relate to the concept of being Two-Spirit. A big point to note when Harlan and I are speaking, we are translating into the English language, of course, so a binary language. So a lot of times we are using words like women and man, but it's more complex than that. We're just translating into a language that folks understand. So for example, the PACHA word translates into like a girl. It's a lot more complex than that, but to explain it in English, we can't. We don't have the words in English to explain it properly. So that's why some of the words are translating to more of a binary. So this is an incomplete list. Harlan has been working tirelessly to get more and more words. So for example, the makeshift word for Two-Spirit is not in there and has been difficult to find. I've been speaking with a number of folks, but we're still working. So it is a beautiful resource though for folks who are working with specific communities.
And these words are so incredibly important. Where there's a word, there's a story and experience, but more importantly, where there's people. In the absence of these words and this framework to understand, often our LGBT and queer and non-binary Indigenous relatives think they have to make a false choice between being LGBT and being Native. And when they find out their word, it centers their ingenuity and calls them back home. And that's the medicine and the power of these words. I just want to share with you some exciting news. Jesse and I just finished presenting with the Stolo Nation, and there was an elder there that actually said their word within their, so we're going to have another word to add to this list for the Stolo Nation. So
and not only did he tell us the word, but he also spoke to the teachings that he got from his family about Two-Spirit people. So we know that certain cultures were able to maintain that concept and still teach it. And then they taught it to their son, who was also on the call, who wasn't Two-Spirit, but strongly supported the Two-Spirit community. And it was like, I had goosebumps the whole time they were talking. It was so empowering. And an interesting point is that we are not alone. So though TwoSpirit is a concept utilized in North America or Turtle Island, there's a number of other countries and communities and cultures that have other words outside of the binary for other genders and other folks. So Samoa, the Fa'afafini, Singapore, the Nawe. So there's a number of communities that still, and this is also a growing list. I just got one I have to tell Harlan from Italy. There's in Italy, there's 4 genders as well in certain communities. So super interesting to learn about that. It's not specific to Canada. TwoSpirit Journal is an amazing thing that Harlan founded. And if you go to the twospiritjournal.com, you can type in resources. There's a number of resources, including this talk or a similar talk to this that is recorded on there, just in case folks want to go back. Travis already mentioned that this is also recorded today, but for more information, there's great resources on that page. So in summary, quickly, TwoSpirit, the intersection of those who embody diverse sexualities, gender roles, and gender expressions, and who are Indigenous to Turtle Island. And it's a community organizing tool, not an identity. So this is extremely important, especially when we start doing research and map it out how we get people to identify within the context of forms. It is also going to mean something different depending on what nation you are from. My best friend Leah, who's TwoSpirit in Halifax, but is from Alberta, completely different identity or relationship to TwoSpirit than I do, though we both are TwoSpirit. TwoSpirit refers to history, tradition that predates Western notions and concepts such as LGBTQI+, and is about reclaiming and restoring a place of honor, respect, and dignity within individuals' nations. This work is deeply decolonizing that centers on one's indigeneity, and calls TwoSpirit people home to mend the sacred hoop and to heal from the trauma that has resulted from the erasure of TwoSpirit people.
Goodness, right? You're like, why do those people speak so fast? And Jesse, great job. You did like that. We actually gained a little bit of time. All right, let's talk about that. All of that. What does that have to do with research? So let's just like go down this path once again. So this is the TwoSpirit Dry Lab, and these are all of the current members, and we're constantly just growing the TwoSpirit Dry Lab, and you'll see Travis is there, you'll see Jesse is there, myself, Nate, Aiden, Janie. Emily is one of our newest members who is Métis and a knowledge translation lead here at BCCDC. Ryan Stillwagon. Okay, and we don't have a kitty cat. Teddy doesn't like having a picture presentation on the web, and so I was like, I need a picture, and they're like, just the cutest kitten ever. So I typed in cutest kitten ever. That's the picture came up. That is Teddy's picture. Okay. How do we work with the TwoSpirit Dry Lab? One, it is a centering of Indigenous ways of being. We also are trans or multidisciplinary collaboration of Indigenous and non-Indigenous epidemiologists, knowledge translation leads, sociology or sociologists, researchers, and not like it's just, and there's also community members, Indigenous and TwoSpirit community members. There's also a core understanding around Indigenous methodologies and approaches. So it's also ontological as well as methodological and epistemological. We take a two-eyed seeing approach from the Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall. With the two-eyed seeing approach is like from one eye, you see all of the goodness and the yumminess around an Indigenous perspective. On the other eye is you see all of, and because not all Western notions are bad. There are some really good things that we would like to lift up. And so we look at the yumminess and the goodness that colonization has brought. And what we do is we harmonize. We don't betray or hierarchy, we harmonize them and we lift them both up at the same time. So that's kind of like how as TwoSpirit people floating between two worlds, we're doing it within the lab. There are meetings and all of our work is done with collaborative. It is non-hierarchical, meaning that no one voice has a power over any voice. And that also feeds into our consensus decision-making process with an aim or a requirement of acceptance by all members of the lab. So we move as one. And if there is one person, like if we arrive someplace and one board member or one of our members is not there with us, it's a failure. So wherever we arrive, when we arrive as one community. We know that it's a good place and that's where we're supposed to be. So primarily right now with the TwoSpirit Dry Lab is we work with the Sex Now data as a data set. Sex Now is Canada's largest and longest running national periodic survey of gay, bi, trans, two-spirit, and queer men's health, sexual and mental wellness. And it starts way back in 2002. We primarily work right now with the 2015 data set. And it is part of the, when they moved it to a national survey. The TwoSpirit Dry Lab, with our with our engagement and use of and familiarity with the 2015 data set, we worked with the principal investigator for the 2018 Sex Now survey, and we asked for some changes and tweaks to be made to that survey instrument to better capture the health-related and experiential knowledges of Indigenous participants. And so we want to share with you a little bit about that work and those amendments. So, going back to the 2015 data set, you can see that we did ask in Q1 gender identity, and you'll see that one of the variables or options was two-spirit. Also in sexual identity, two-spirit was asked. And then we also asked for ethnic and cultural identity in Q70 for Aboriginal being defined as First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. When we looked at the 2015 data set, 4.5% of the overall sample size were Aboriginal, and that would be an N value of 363. 156 selected two-spirit in either Q1 or 2, but when we ran that 156 of who selected two-spirit in either Q1 or Q2, and we cross-referenced it with Aboriginal, about 62% of those who selected two-spirit were not Aboriginal or Indigenous. And so we blew them out of our study because, again, it is sexual identity or gender identity combined with indigeneity opens up the possibility for two-spirit. And so you can kind of see the messiness of there was all these folks that we blew them out of our survey because they weren't Aboriginal. So to correct that is that when we met with the principal investigator of 2015, who is also a member of the TwoSpirit Dry Lab, Nate. And we said, hey, Nate, we have a proposition, a better way of collecting two-spirit. And so we said, let's put two-spirit in the ethnicity category or the cultural ethnic category. So if you look here, it is a 3-step process. So first of all, someone had to select that they were Indigenous. Then they had to define whether or not that they're First Nations, Métis, Inuit, prefer to self-describe, prefer not to say, give the option too, right? And then, and only then, did the term two-spirit pop up of yes and no. And what we found was with the 2018 survey sample, which was an in-person data collection where we went to, I think, 16 prides, a lot of pride, because there was a lot of pride that summer. About 9% of the survey participants were Indigenous, giving us an N value of 314. And broken down, about 60% were First Nations, 38% Métis, and about 3% were Inuk. 42% of that 314 of the Indigenous respondents said that they were two-spirit. So that's kind of cool. And 0% of the respondents were not Aboriginal. So we effectively walled off and we made it only for Indigenous participants, which it was kind of cool. But then also the yumminess around this is, as Jesse was like saying, and what is, I'm a gay man as well as I am a man, right? And so because I honored two-spirit within the Indigenous, under the Indigenous question, I can then also answer questions of like, how do I show up in the Western world? And so I could honor my gay identity or my bisexual identity. And so you also get a much more complex, nuanced picture, but it enters into that analysis that's kind of cool. So there's really cool ways that we can like slice and dice that data. If you want to learn more about this, copy that URL, or Travis will pop it into the chat of CIHR, the Canadian Institute for Health Research, Meet the Method series, issue number 2. And Travis and I articulate out of what and who two-spirit people is in health research and that method of how to collect two-spirit data. All right. Decolonizing and challenging research. So not only do we, how we collect that data, it's what do we do with that data and some of the ways in which that we can decolonize the research process. So Apple says to Orange, we're both fruit, we both are round, we both grow on trees, so we must make us the same, right? And the orange was like, sorry, noodle, no, we do not taste the same, and we are really different. And so for the TwoSpirit Dry Lab is normally how health research works is you have this broader data set, sex now, you extract a subpopulation, and it being Indigenous, and then what you do is you do this compare and contrast. You're comparing oranges to apples. And also around that, it has also been incredibly problematic in that I am never going to be non-Indigenous. So why am I being compared to Indigenous people? And we've created an inequity, a structural inequity, in which that Indigenous people are often or the subpopulation is always less than. And I've always been incredibly uncomfortable about that because standing in front of my community is I don't want to stand in front of my Indigenous community and say, hey, Indigenous community, you're going to die younger, you're going to get HIV more, or you're going to be poorer, or have less education, less opportunity. And within that, we position and we're saying you're less than, or you're never going to meet that mark. And also implicitly, we speak into the void. And so if there is someone who is non-Indigenous and listening to that report, what they're going to implicitly hear is, I'm going to live longer. I'm not going to be affected by that disease. I'm going to have more education, thereby more money, more opportunity. And I will argue that that type of scholarship and communication it becomes a site of white supremacy. And so we must challenge that. So what the Dry Lab does, larger data set, extract the Indigenous, ignore the larger data set, and we start doing these intra comparisons of Indigenous people to Indigenous people. So we become the referent group. And so again, the intra-group, look at the diversity within the oranges, that there's sweet oranges, there's bitter oranges, there's darker colored oranges, and we can now start comparing the oranges to oranges. Also, we challenge and looking at the testing for the null hypothesis. We assume that two groups have no differences, right? But showing that there is a difference, further analysis is warranted. Goodness, right? Resulting in innumerable and ad nauseum studies that establish that health indicators for Indigenous people differ from non-Indigenous counterparts. By not contributing further knowledge, but merely rehashing and hashing the known that we're different. By accepting these differences exist, we acknowledge that health inequities exist, while simultaneously freeing the researcher as well as ourselves and policymakers to look at the strengths in our communities rather than the deficiencies and that reject the null hypothesis allows us. And so we really don't want to do that type of research for many, many, many reasons. So what does that look like in health research? So again, what we did was we extracted all of the Indigenous respondents and we're like, hey, can we figure out and can we quantify the drivers of sexual health knowledge? And we said, yeah, from the 2014 data set, we can quantify the sexual health knowledge on a 6-point scale. So in this study, what we wanted to do was to look at the drivers of sexual health knowledge for two-spirit, gay, bi, and or Indigenous men who have sex with men, or the GBMSM community. In this study, we compared the responses of those who used two-spirit to those who described themselves as Indigenous individuals who did not use two-spirit, the GBMSM community. What we found that there were significant differences within the drivers of sexual health knowledge between those two populations. Then we examined the responses between those who lived in urban compared to rural and remote areas. And once again, we found significant differences. One of them was the use of two-spirit. From this analysis, we can offer guidance for those who are working or wanting to work with Indigenous and two-spirit peoples and communities in more respectful ways. And you can kind of see that there is a shifting within the conversation right there. There's nothing to do with deficiencies. It's just the differences within the communities. And how do you want to better engage with those people, those Indigenous people that use two-spirit, as those Indigenous people who don't use two-spirit? And you can get this really kind of much more actionable landing or outputs or changes within the services as well as the policies. Another thing that the TwoSpirit Dry Lab is doing is we all, hopefully you've heard of Audre Lorde, and Audre Lorde has this amazing quote. Those of us who stand outside of the circle of society's definition of acceptable woman or acceptable gender. Those of us who have been forged in the cubicles of differences. Those of us who are poor, those of us who are lesbians, who are Black, who are older, who know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and make them our strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. You may think you'll get some gains, but you will never dismantle the house. And so we use this, but we slightly amend her quote because we do agree that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And with the slight change that we do with Audre Lorde's statement is that the master's tools, what we just do is we ignore the master's house. We go down the street and we build our own house that is building and constructing our own Indigenous based on Indigenous ontologies, epistemologies, as well as methodologies. Quantitative analysis is beautiful. We think it is, and so I'll share how does that happen, right? Going back to the drivers of sexual health knowledge, right, where we were looking at these relationships, which is what quantitative analysis does. Meryl Singer came up with this term in 1994 called Syndemics. And Syndemics is this mutual reinforcing interaction of a disease of social conditions, right? Of like looking at like how violence is a driver of whether or not someone will get HIV, as is substance use, as is adverse mental health. But okay, now I have 3 minutes. But Meryl Singer said that, it's kind of like if you have these like various social conditions, if you have them at play, that they compound and they exponentially increase the risk of someone getting HIV. And so he coined this term Syndemics, right? And it seems to be really hot right now. It is like everyone's like using Syndemics and the theory of Syndemics. And when Travis and I met way back in the day, we started talking about Syndemics, right? And I was like, there's a Sioux expression, metakwiosin. And it's a Sioux expression. And it literally translates, well, first of all, it's said in prayer. So this is a ceremonial word and expression. And metakwiosin translates to all my relations, but a closer connection, a closer translation of metakwiosin is all my relations, or everything is connected, everything is related. And not only related within like social conditions, but with the natural world, with the rocks, the birds, the sky, the air, to the winged kingdom, to the standing silent nation. Everything is in play. Kind of sounds like Syndemics, right? Except different. And so for the TwoSpirit Dry Lab, for our paper that we wrote on the drivers of sexual health knowledge, is that we did not use Western theory of Syndemics. We used an Indigenous framework, an Indigenous understanding of metakwiosin, and that was our theoretical understanding. And you can kind of see how we're using the master's tools not to affirm or try to dismantle this. We're just taking our tools and we're using quantitative analysis to show and tease out relationships of how things are interrelated, how things are connected, and what is the power of that connection or the influence of that. And so we can quantify metakwiosin. That's why we take the master's tools, we ignore the master's house, we go down the block and we create our own house. And that is the radicalness of this work. Because although Singer thinks that he thought of this, like we have a simple expression explaining our worldview of like been there, done that, right? Had you come and asked us, we would have told you about metakwiosin. So in health research for TwoSpirit, is when TwoSpirit data is collected in a culturally safe and affirming way. Health researchers are given the opportunity to promote rigorous science that considers all biological sex as well as all genders. Research conducted in this way has the potential to expand our collective understanding as well as wisdom of health within a diversity framework that considers all determinants such as ethnicity, race, socioeconomic status, disability, sexual orientation, migration status, geography, age, and interacts with sex and gender at the same time. By bringing these considerations into focus, we can formulate health research, policy, and programs that are relevant to the diversity that exists within our entire population. Okay, references. I used to be able to say my granny said, now I actually have to say references. Here they are. How I formally say a thank you in Cree is wawa. Informally, we would just say hi hi. And examaga is how we would say until the next time we meet. Jesse.
In Maychif, it's similar translation as to what maybe we meet again, or all my relations is Ishmish Pashko.